Okay, this is just a quick video to explore Musique Concrète in a little bit more detail because the book doesn't go into it anywhere near as much as it could. And just to give you a little bit more context on it. So Musique Concrète is related to gramophone music, which we talked about in class and that's in the book already. Specifically, it's going off of the work of Hindemith and Tock and the two pieces for trick recordings that they created in the New Music Berlin concert of 1930. Musique Concrète is characterized by the use of recorded sounds as the raw material of the composition. By and large, that means that these are not pieces that can be written in standard notation. You don't have a nice score for, say, violin and piano or cello and flute. But at the same time, they're not purely electronic pieces like what Stockhausen and Ligeti would create in the 50s and 60s, where all of the sound is being generated through oscillators and filters and is 100% created using only electronic means. As a style, Musique Concrète is characterized by manipulation more than anything else. Using the recordings that they've created and compiled, composers will edit these to create sonic collages where they're adjusting the pitch, the speed, the playback direction. Reversing sounds is very, very common, and applying effects to individual sound snippets that are decoupled from their original context. To do that, composers will very, very frequently splice sounds. So you might have a recording of 3 or 4 hits of a bottle against a metal trash can, and then splice out the second one and use that in your piece, whereas you ignore the others. In addition to splicing out individual sounds, they will also splice out part of a sound, removing the initial attack phase to just let the sound ring, but without that attack transient that tells the ear what it's really listening to. Doing that, they can also create hybrid sounds by taking the attack phase of one sound and splicing in the sustain and decay of another to create these sonic hybrids. They can adjust the volume envelope to change how the sound is shaped over the course of its duration so that it might stay at a constant volume, or that it might swell in the middle, or that it might decrescendo very quickly. And they can adjust the fades to create long, long, droning ambient sounds. It's very fun. Integral to the idea of musique concrète is what's called the idea of the sound object, or objet sonore in the original French. These are the raw recorded sounds completely decoupled and removed from its original source and context. So what does that mean? Well, in the strictest definition, it means that when you hear a sound object in a piece of musique concrète, you should not be able to tell what the sound is when you're listening to it. That you should have some sort of ambiguity, that not being able to see the sound being produced, your ear should maybe have an idea that it sounds similar to something, but you shouldn't be able to 100% say with any certainty what the sound is. The choice of the sound material and the objects that are compiled is very malleable. Concrète, by definition, means real. It's the sound of everyday objects and things, so non-musical sources. Hitting pots and pans together, shuffling a deck of cards, dropping a book onto the table, wind blowing across the microphone, industrial sounds, nature sounds, your dog coming in mid-recording and starting to bark, anything like that. But it can also incorporate musical material that, again, is decoupled and removed from the original context. So this could be isolated notes from a gong, or it could be a singer doing a warm-up exercise, and then you're splicing out an individual note here and there from the exercise. But the key here is that it's not an entire passage of music. You're not hearing a musical phrase, ascending and descending notes, arpeggios, whatever, that it's completely removed from the context. For this class, however, we're going to be avoiding musical material. So anything from an instrument, voice, or existing recording of audio, so a band, a rapper, a symphony, anything like that. And the reason for that is that these tend to be the hardest to separate from a source and to completely decouple from the context when you're just starting out. It's easier to go from something a little bit more abstract, like to take the sound of a door slamming or an alarm clock and work with that when you're first getting started. A little bit about the history. Obviously, the invention of the phonograph was essential to developing Musique Concrète. And in fact, composers really kind of went crazy once they started realizing the possibilities of what they could do with the phonograph. One of the first major pieces to incorporate that in it was Ottorino Respighi's piece, The Pines of Rome from 1924, which is a symphonic poem for full orchestra that uses a recording of a nightingale to perfectly recreate the bird call in that. But there's some other really interesting precedents as well. There is Luigi Russolo's book, The Art of Noises from 1913, where Russolo argues that humans have become too used to the sounds of everyday life in an urban industrial landscape, and that composers need to adapt to this by incorporating electronics that add, as he said, an infinite variety of timbres in noises into their work. And he did exactly that. Russolo built a number of devices that produced varying types of noises and put on concerts using these noisemakers. Unfortunately, they were almost all destroyed, and we have no idea what they sound like. Another major thing that happened before the development of Concrète was Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School, which is approximately 1903 to 1925. Where in the post-Wagner era, Schoenberg and his students pioneered the use of serialist and atonal techniques in reaction to the tonal structures of previous classical music. Basically, they just said, look, we've pushed tonality as far as it can possibly go. You know, we can write a 1-4-5-1 chord progression over and over, but we're not going to write any new music. And so they came up with techniques of using every note within the chromatic octave before you could reuse another pitch. So you have to go through all the other 11 notes before you can repeat note 1. And this led to a break with tonality and what was known as the emancipation of the dissonance. Pieces started getting noisier, they started getting more experimental, and it proved very fertile ground for a lot of composers. As I've already mentioned, there was the New Music Berlin concert in 1930, which included the 2 gramophone works of Hindemith and Tach. This is really important because, among others who were in attendance, was the American composer John Cage, who was working his way through Europe on tour at that point. And he was extremely influenced by what he heard there and would later go on to become a very important composer of Musique Concrète and of other styles of music. Another one that has to be mentioned is Egyptian composer Halim El-Dab, who was working in a radio studio in the early 1940s and got his hands on an early wire recorder, which was a predecessor to the tape recorder, and started walking around downtown Cairo and recording the sounds that he could pick up on his microphone. This led to his piece, The Expression of Czar, from 1944, which is a 20-minute work created by manipulating a small wire recording of a public exorcism ritual in downtown Cairo. It is wild. He's adjusting the speed, playing with the pitch, adding some basic effects like reverb, and it's very, very easy to do what he did now, but at the time it was revolutionary. And even by today's standards, it's still a very interesting piece. All of this kind of leads up to post-World War II Europe, where composers in particular are really, really disillusioned with the past and with the music of the past in particular. You know, you've just gone through the Belle Epoque and then World War I and then the Roaring Twenties, and all of this music just didn't seem to satisfy anyone anymore. Primarily, this led to a lot of composers shifting to serialist technique, free atonality, and experimenting to move even further in search of new methods of composition and direct control over musical material. You would have things like total serialism, Messiaen's modes of limited transposition, and the development of the electronic studio in the 1950s. But the big one was Pierre Schaeffer, who began experimenting with microphones, sound recording, and processing while working at the Studio d'Essai de la Radiodiffusion Nationale, which was a radio station supported by the French resistance during World War II. Beyond just looking at music and sound, though, Schaeffer was a huge film buff and was really influenced by the idea of cutting and montage techniques that he saw in films, and followed a lot of what was happening with cinematography and began to experiment with the newly available tape recorder to collect concrete sounds wherever they came from and to abstract the musical values they were potentially containing using studio equipment in order to create sonic collages of these sound objects. So this now meant that by recording sounds from out in the world, stripping them of context, editing them, manipulating them, a composer could actually record, manipulate, and arrange any sound they wanted exactly how they want it onto a piece. This is revolutionary because before then, you would have to write a score and then hope and pray that you would have enough rehearsal time to get the musicians to do exactly what you wanted. And musicians have minds of their own, of course. They don't necessarily want to do what the composer says. They might not be able to do what the composer says. This gives the composer the ability to do whatever they want. And boy, would they take advantage of that. So Schaeffer presented his first concert of Musique Concrète in 1948, including his famous Études au chemin de fer, or Study for Railroads, which uses railroad sounds as its only source material. The concert is really, really influential because, among others, it's tended by Pierre Henry, who would very famously collaborate with Schaeffer for years until they had a bit of a break, and then would go on to form his own studio, which became the GRM studio. Then also Michel Chion was there, who would go on to write many, many, many Musique Concrète pieces of his own. Other notable composers that would adopt this technique of Musique Concrète and manipulating sound objects to create new works that they could control every facet of the sound of. Primarily, you would have people like Pierre Boulez, Edgar Varese, and Ioannis Xenakis, all of whom were operating in Paris. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen out of Cologne, although he would also do a lot with pure electronic music. In the UK, interestingly, you had Delia Derbyshire and Daphne Aram, both of whom worked in the BBC radiophonic laboratory, among other things, and would work on creating radio drama sound effects, and also creating the sound effects for Doctor Who in the early versions. Daphne Aram also is very famous for creating the Aramix synthesizer you can find on YouTube. It is very interesting because you would draw the actual waveforms in envelopes and the machine would read them through transparencies and use that to control the oscillators. It's very cool. In the US, you had, in addition to John Cage, Ilhan Mimaroglu, who was working out of the Columbia Princeton studio in New York City. We have some very, very good works from him. One piece in particular called Bowery Bum that I really recommend you take a listen to. And very importantly, James Tenney, who was working briefly out of Bell Labs with Max Matthews, among others. So this quickly spread. It became a very influential way of creating music out of non-musical materials for composers, and was a very important post-war style of composition that would eventually give way to things like sampling, which can be traced directly to concrete and then back to gramophone music, and also to pure electronic music, specifically the Stockhausen style that would develop in Cologne. But now it's very common for composers of experimental or acousmatic music to incorporate aspects of Musique Concrète into their work, but they might not follow all of the rules. They might use explicitly musical material, things like drums, actual melodies played by a real instrument or sung by a real singer. And that's become kind of common practice now, to go beyond the strictest definition of only using decoupled sound objects. But just a little bit of background on a very, very complex topic. As always, if you have any questions, post them in the forum or let me know and set up a time to meet. I am more than happy to go into this in much, much more detail.